Okay, well, welcome everybody. We are here with Alex Borucki, professor in the History Department. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's very nice having you here. So let's start from the beginning. How did you get to work in the African diaspora, specifically in the Rio de la Plata area?
Yeah.
What did it get you, there is a story, there is something that drove you towards there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was an undergrad in Uruguay, in Montevideo, in the late 1990s. I was doing a course on the history of Uruguay, colonial and 19th century. And I was working already with two other friends, which we share some of the classes and doing that. Okay, what we work for the final paper of that class. I'm talking like 1997, 1998, something like that. And we wanted to work on archival sources, judicial records, inventories, wills, stories about crime, stories about property transference on the early 19th century. We went to the judicial records, to the National Archives as fetishism for the primary sources for the documents. And we were looking also at the borderland between what is today Uruguay and Brazil. And every will, every testament, every criminal case had something to do with people of African ancestry, either enslaved or free. And that was literally the archive that spoke to us, and we say, okay, we have to work on this. This was in the late 1990s, and in 2004, which is 20 years ago, we published this book, Esclavitud y Trabajo, un estudio sobre los afrodescendientes en la frontera uruguaya, or Slavery and Labor, a study of afrodescendants in the Uruguayan borderland. And since then, I've been working on the histories of enslavement, not only in the Rio de la Plata, but also in the larger Atlantic world, for the Caribbean, connecting the Rio de la Plata with Brazil, connecting the Caribbean with Africa, the Spanish Caribbean with the British Caribbean, with the Dutch Caribbean as well. So it has been one thing that led me to the other one. I started working on slavery in cattle ranches, on black cowboys of the 19th century of the Pampas. And then when I started to work on my PhD and other books and articles working on the slave trade, on the movement of enslaved Africans in slave ships to the Rio de la Plata, but also to other places.
So interesting. So it's one of those cases where the archive is actually speaking to you. You come with an idea and you leave with something else, right?
Yeah. It sounds very positivist, like there is no mediation between you and the archive, but it was overwhelming too. And from working with judicial records, we went to censuses of population of that area, what is today the eastern part of Uruguay, that is next to Brazil. And of course, there were enslaved people there as well. So we connected one type of source with the other one. And this also was great for keeping in contact with my friends there in Uruguay. A month ago, I have a Zoom talk organized in Uruguay, and I was with the other two people that published this book, Natalia Stala and Carla Chagas, who since then I've been in contact for more than 20 years. Yeah.
Wow. And about the archive, it looks like you work with the archive. Not as positive probably as I put it, but you came out with this idea and now you're contributing back to the archive, right? You had this amazing database that you developed with Greg O'Malley, right? So talk us a little bit about this project. Tell us where is it going, what has it already done for the Atlantic history, and what do you hope it will keep doing for the Atlantic history?
Well, this database is about the movement of enslaved Africans in a slave ship from one port of the Americas to another port of the Americas. It hosted in the Voyages website, that is www.slavevoyages.org, that already existed before, which is a website that contains a database of individual slave voyages bringing enslaved Africans from Africa to the Americas. And what we added was the connection of slave trading routes within the New World, because enslaved Africans, when they arrived, let's say, to Rio de Janeiro, sometimes they didn't stop in Rio de Janeiro, and they were forcibly carried to other ports like Buenos Aires and Montevideo. This story also is common in other places in the Americas. People who arrived in Jamaica in the 18th century, but they end up in Havana. Or people who arrived into the Dutch island of Curacao in front of Venezuela and were reshipped to Venezuela or to Colombia. Or here in the United States as well, people who arrived to Barbados or Jamaica and end up in South Carolina or in New York. So this showed the capillarity of the slave trade beyond the largest port receiving enslaved Africans like Rio de Janeiro, Havana, or the important plantation zones like Jamaica or Saint Domingue, and points to the connection of seemingly distant places, especially places that belonged to different empires like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, the French as well. And for the case of the Spanish Americas, this is particularly important because out of probably 2 million enslaved Africans who arrived in the whole history of this horrific traffic from the 1500s to the late 19th century, probably 600,000 did not arrive directly from Africa, let's say to Buenos Aires, Havana, or Cartagena, but they arrived through these internal slave trading routes that were coming from colonies of other empires, like from Brazil to the Rio de la Plata, from the British Caribbean to Cartagena, or for the Dutch Caribbean to Venezuela. So it was very important to contribute not only to the histories of slave trading to the whole of the Spanish Americas, but also to individual stories of nations like Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, and Argentina and Uruguay, or the Rio de la Plata, as we say, combined. Yeah.
It's very interesting. It caught my attention that you use this word capillarity, no? I think it's very poetic because he's almost describing like the American continent like a body, and all these traits being like a very important, essential part, unfortunately or fortunately, right, to the progress and to the build-up of the continent. And talking about that, talking about how essential were the African descendants in this country, you focus on the history of Jacinto Ventura de Molina, correct?
That's the other thing that I brought today.
Perfect.
Yes.
Excellent. So what I'm very interested in is what drew you our attention to his story, and mostly what have you learned on working with his words and revisiting everything that he did to publish that book.
Yeah.
What did you learn from all that?
Yeah. Jacinto Ventura de Molina was born in 1766 or 1764, 1766, in the town of Rio Grande, which is today Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, in the southernmost state of Brazil. But he was born there during the Spanish occupation of that town. And he lived most of his life in Spanish, Rio de la Plata, in Montevideo and in Buenos Aires. And he left records about his life, a life that spanned the years of the transatlantic slave trade. Both of his parents had survived the transatlantic slave trade, that a life that survived the warfares between European empires, the Portuguese against the Spanish, the coming of the revolution in the Rio de la Plata, the Portuguese occupation and then Brazilian occupation of what became Uruguay. And he had written about all of this because he learned how to read and write very early on his life. Something that it's rare but is not unique for people of African ancestry in colonial Latin America. What is rare and unique was that his writings, his manuscript, a part of his manuscript, have survived all the way to today. Usually you have either the colonial state or the colonial church keeping records about Catholicism or the colonial state. So manuscript produced by black writers, they have no logic to be incorporated into the colonial archive or the archive of the Catholic Church. In his case, 3 volumes of his manuscripts, probably from the 1810s to the late 1830s, survived and were passed to private collectors in Montevideo and miraculously made it into the National Library of Uruguay. And I say this miraculously because there are very few autobiographical writings of people of African ancestry before the end of the 19th century. You can count them with one hand, with 2 hands, if you are very generous about that. Like Juan Francisco Manzano, Ricardo Batrel for Cuba, and a few others for Brazil. Usually you have contacts of Africans and people of African ancestry with manuscript culture when they engage the colonial state, when they send petitions to the Spanish crown, when they send petitions as a confraternity, as a Black Catholic confraternity, or when they find themselves being oppressed by the colonial state, or in the process of the sacraments of the Catholic Church, in Catholic Church records, but not produced by themselves because they wanted to produce it about literary creation, about writing about their past, about writing about their life. And that was what made Jacinto unique indeed. And also because he shows the complexities of black royalism, meaning people of African ancestry that when the revolution started, rather than joining the revolution, they wanted to keep with the Spanish crown, which makes even more complex his story.
And what were your revelations that you have, or something that you really learned that you didn't expect to find in there?
Well, for instance, that he had a whole pantheon of the black royalist Atlantic, meaning of black leaders that he saw himself, who were sometimes biblical figures, sometimes saints of the Catholic Church, and sometimes some of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, of the Revolution of Saint-Domingue, but who sided with Spain, like Jean-François and Biassou, who end up, one of them in Cadiz, in Spain, that is Jean-François, and the other one, Biassou, who end up in Florida, in St. Augustine, if I'm not mistaken. So when he tries to present himself to the Uruguayan authorities as the leader of El Pueblo Negro, or the black people, as he wrote, he presents like an entire history of black leadership and black loyalism coming from characters of the Old Testament to leaders of the Haitian Revolution. Of the Haitian Revolution. I should drink a water.
Por favor.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, maybe I can follow up with a question. Do you think this royal loyalty that he demonstrated may have been what motivated people to save his manuscripts, maybe?
Probably yes, because one of his protectors in Montevideo, that he mentioned a lot, we assume that these 3 volumes of his manuscripts end up in his private collection, and then another private collector bought that collection, and it was the National Library of Uruguay in the 1990s who got those manuscripts in a public auction and marvelously didn't end up in some private collector, and then we cannot leave it, or here in the United States as well, which is usually the case. Yeah.
Wow, incredible. And moving on to something maybe a little bit more recent, I read, I think it's the most recent article you published about the 250 years
Mhm.
of slave trade in the Rio de la Plata. You really do a work there of quantifying,
Yeah.
right? Giving us a number, and you come out to close to a 200,000,
Yeah.
right? African people that got moved throughout the Rio de la Plata in about 250
Yeah,
years,
from
right?
the foundation of Buenos Aires to 1835.
Exactly. And what I wonder is, what do you, other than just the numbers, if those numbers are teaching us something important,
Mm.
let me rephrase the question. Why are those numbers so important? What defining those numbers so carefully is so important? What difference can you make with that?
Those numbers came as a byproduct of trying to find from where these people came, from which specific places in Africa, and also for the Rio de la Plata in Brazil, and also which were the slave trading routes that brought them at different
Mhm.
times through the history of the Rio de la Plata, and also to have all of that information put together, because sometimes people make assertions regarding the late colonial period, but forgetting how important was the slave trade from the
Mhm.
foundation of the Rio de la Plata, and also how long this history is for Argentina and Uruguay. Argentina and Uruguay are countries of a little bit more than 200 years. The history of slave trade in this region was of 250 years, basically from the foundation of Buenos Aires, in which basically Buenos Aires survived because it was a slave trading port from 1580 to 1640, through the late colonial period, basically through the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, in which probably the slave trade was a quarter of the whole traffic of the commerce of goods, meaning in the Rio de la Plata, and in which also Montevideo and Buenos Aires were stopovers for enslaved Africans who arrived there and continue crossing through what is today Argentina into Mendoza, going across the Andes and being embarked in the port of Valparaíso in Chile to end in Lima, in the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Probably half of the people who arrived as enslaved people in that era of the late colonial times, from the late 1770s to the beginning of the Revolution of Independence in the Rio de la Plata, continue outside of Buenos Aires and outside of Montevideo, going to Chile and then going to Peru, which points that the Rio de la Plata also was a region that trafficked enslaved people to other areas.
Okay, and I'm guessing here that being Buenos Aires such an important port, and at that era depended very much its economy on the port and the activity that
Yeah.
motivated probably, right, the trade to go through. I mean, Buenos Aires to accept this trade because of port fees and everything, right?
Yeah. For the both at the beginning, they what received the colonial state regarding the slave trade and the contraband of enslaved people as well, was basically the funds funding the colonial state in Buenos Aires for 1580 to 1640. There was no Buenos Aires without slave trade in the early 17th century. And then in the late 18th century, almost every merchant or almost every significant merchant of Buenos Aires at least engaged to a certain degree in the slave trade, even by reselling enslaved people within the city, or by sending enslaved people from Buenos Aires to Valparaíso to be shipped eventually to Lima. There were some slave traders who were very significant and were very important for the city of Buenos Aires, but also this created a much more population, a much more larger population for the city of Buenos Aires, and a more transient population, meaning you have to feed these people. Also, you have to move these people. You have to pay other people to move enslaved Africans from Buenos Aires to Mendoza and so on. There is, again, the capillarity of the slave trade. You see how this activity involved much more people than the enslaved and the slavers.
Impressive and impressive research. I mean, I saw all the archival work you had to do over there, and in the article it was very interesting to me. You explained very well the because, by the way, let me say this: I think you write very well. A lot of times
Oh,
in these kind of articles, especially someone that comes from literature gets a little lost. Instead, you had an excellent narrative, and I think you define very well the struggle with this archive because it's so fragmented, right? And I think that's probably the biggest challenge you have to deal with when you are doing this kind of work. Tell me if I'm wrong, and tell me how that works exactly.
well, um, part of the problems of writing the histories of the slave trade in the Spanish Americas is the fracture of archives. You have to do too many archives, not just to the archives, to the national archives, let's say in Buenos Aires and Montevideo. You have to do also the archives in Spain, the Archivo General de Indias, the archive of the colonial of the Spanish Empire. I mean, but also you have to be very attentive to the Portuguese archives in Brazil and in Portugal. And for the contraband, you also have to see the archives of the slave traders.
Hmm.
That can be, for instance, American slave traders, meaning from the United States, who left records about their activities in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, and whose correspondence is housed in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, in other parts of New England, or sometimes archives of slave traders who were based in the Rio de la Plata, who sometimes their private papers made it to the national libraries. That's happened, for instance, in Chile, where two major slave traders who lived in Chile, her personal papers end up in the National Library of Santiago de Chile, and this has the details of how the contraband was conducted, particularly the contraband of silver in order to pay for enslaved Africans that were arriving into Chile at that time.
It really sounds like an Herculean job to do so. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And about Herculean's projects, I know sometimes new books can be very daunting. I know the book you have in process promises to explore how Spanish imperial expansion, right, intervene and work with this slave trade.
Mhm.
And but what caught my attention was that you want to focus, and I quote, on the people caught up in these historical forces.
Mhm.
So why this kind of focus? History usually focuses just on the big empires and the big forces. Why do you want to focus on the people that are caught up?
Well, it's while working these histories of the organization of the traffic of captives, is very easy to go big, to go on
Exactly.
macro narratives, and you have to point to the experience of people surviving this, and to what degree they could shape these
Mhm.
dynamics as well. Just for example, while working on the slave trade to Venezuela in the late 18th century, um, I'm working with a Spanish historian, José Luis Belmonte Postigo, and we were tracking the organization of a slave trade contract made by English slave traders who live in Jamaica. So they were Jamaica-based
Mhm.
slave traders in order to send enslaved people to Venezuela. They have these kind of connections with colonial politicians in Spain, in England, to make this kind of agreement. But these were mostly slave traders who work already in the Caribbean. They bring they brought enslaved Africans uh, to Venezuela by subcontracting with English slavers who lived in England and who were the ones embarking people in Africa. But at the same time, they were on a line of business of the slave within the slave trade, which was specialized in the case of the Caribbean of selling people who stay longer in the slave market. Why they stay longer? Because enslavers didn't want to buy them as frequently as others. They were not healthy men, but they were children, old people, very sick people. In English, they were known as refuse slaves. And because they were sick, too old, too young, they stay longer in the market, creating more expensive for slave traders. And these slave traders in the Caribbean, there were some who specialized in selling these refuse slaves, particularly across imperial borders. So these same Jamaica-based slave traders who were organizing this scheme in order to bring enslaved Africans from Africa to Venezuela, at the same time were reselling these refuse enslaved people to Cuba, to Trinidad, in what is today the country of Trinidad, but at that time was colonial Venezuela, as something of a side business, and point to how enslaved people sometimes stay much longer than we think in that vulnerable position that was living in the slave market. And also point at how difficult sometimes is to chart slave trading routes, like from point A to point B. For those who were refused enslaved, those stories are much longer and much complicated, as they stay longer in the market and they have to survive further reshipments from one island to another one. Let's say that they arrive in Grenada in the British Caribbean, they were reshipped to Trinidad, and from Trinidad they end up going into Havana to Cuba.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sounds really like a nightmare.
Yes.
And any ideas when we can expect this book? I'm very excited about it.
A couple of years more.
Okay,
yeah,
perfect. No. So we'll still have to wait a little bit.
It's the part of Joyce, but also the other part of writing collaboratively.
Yes, as I was saying, right, Herculean tasks. So it was a pleasure to have you here, Alex. We wish you all the best for the future, and we're really looking forward for this new book. I really want to eat it as soon as it comes out.
Great,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
¿Está bien? Gracias, Alex.
Bueno.
Muchísimas gracias, profe.
Si vos me dejás hablando, yo puedo estar hablando 5 horas de esto.
Sí,
¿viste?
no.
Yo
y a mí también.
Por adentro decía, no, hay que bajar.
No, menos mal que me avisó ella, porque si no yo seguía. No, me encantó la charla. No, y la verdad que nos tenemos que juntar cuando tengas un tiempito para un café o algo,
sí.
Porque estoy muy interesado. Y sí, en serio, quiero leer el libro. Porque lo quería leer ya antes, y ahora que me dijiste esto, me parece tan interesante esta posición que tenían estos en el medio. Me parecen unos pícaros, ¿no? Unos, como decimos en porteño, ¿no? Unos, en Italia se llaman traffichini, ¿no? Gente que está dispuesta a cualquier cosa.
Y además nunca le podés creer una contabilidad a un traficante de esclavos.
Claro,
es un traficante de esclavos.
Claro. Pero al mismo tiempo lo que tenés para trabajar, ¿no?
Sí.
Entonces,
y siempre dejan algún registro en ese sentido. Sí. Por eso es que también, al haber sido los esclavos propiedad, es por eso que no es tan difícil poder rastrear hacia dónde iban, justamente por el tema de las transacciones. Es mucho más difícil el tema de las subjetividades, y por eso Jacinto es tan importante.
Sí. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Gracias por tu tiempo. Y nada, va a estar subiendo la entrevista. Quizás que nos tenga que ayudar con eso también, ¿no? Pero bueno, un gustazo, Alex.
Chaucito.
Muchísimas gracias.